Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Those who are with us in person, those who are joining us virtually, we're so happy to have you here. Welcome to Access Week, McNair Research Symposium. Make some noise. Thank you, thank you. I was waiting for you guys to say good morning back when I said good morning, so thank you. Good morning to our virtual audience as well. Thank you all for joining us. So I wanted to make some time and space for some opening remarks from our Associate Vice Chancellor for Educational Equity, Dr. Tiffany Butler.
Well, good morning. I'm very excited to see everyone here today. It's awesome to be in the room with so many fabulous scholars. My name is Dr. Tiffany Butler, the Associate Vice Chancellor for Educational Equity in the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement, or DICE as we affectionately call it. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Welcome to Access Week 2022. We're in day 3, and the aim of Access Week is to create campus awareness for the need for an equity mindset to help all students thrive in service of unlocking pathways of success for our students. This year's theme is Enacting Beloved Community, and we believe that we achieve this by serving students holistically. So today's Access Week event starts with the McNair Research Symposium for students, faculty, and staff within the Rutgers University community. The Rutgers University New Brunswick Ronald E. McNair Baccalaureate Achievement Program prepares students for low-income, first-generation, and historically underserved backgrounds for doctoral studies. This event will serve as a research symposium for McNair scholars to present their research. This event will also consist of oral and poster presentations highlighting McNair scholar research that scholars have presented this past summer through internships or ongoing projects from the previous academic year. In addition to those presentations, there will also be an asynchronous component, and we'll discuss how to become involved in research at Rutgers and promote summer research opportunities available to students to take advantage across the nation. So I'm going to go a little bit off script because as I see all of the scholars in the room today, remember that today is a day to celebrate you as well. So in Access Week, we're not only trying to unlock pathway to success, but also celebrating the accomplishments that you have made. And so as one former student researcher to another, don't forget to shine today. You've worked months, maybe years on the work that you're going to be standing next to. Do not forget to shine. We're very excited to be able to see the work that you've done and so excited for the things that you'll accomplish. So on behalf of the entire DICE division, our Senior Vice President for Equity, Dr. Annabong Anna Branch, and the Educational Equity Group, welcome to Access Week 2022.
Thank you, Dr. Butler, for those wonderful remarks. I would be remiss if I did not introduce myself. I'm so sorry I jumped on here and just started. So my name is Christina Chisholm. I'm the director of the McNair Scholars Program, and thank you, scholars. I do want to acknowledge that we are on Native land, and so we acknowledge that the land on which we stand is the ancestral territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to Indigenous people throughout the Lenape diaspora, past, present, and future, and honor those that have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. We also acknowledge that Rutgers University, like New Jersey and the United States as a nation, was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. And then lastly, we'd love to acknowledge you all for joining us. So if you came in person, we appreciate it. We know schedules are hectic, times are busy. We are still living through an ongoing pandemic as COVID-19 is ever present. So whether you're competing with social events, personal activities, and family events, or upcoming deadlines, we just want to acknowledge you and thank you for joining us.
My name is Aldazia Green, and I'm a McNair Scholar. Over the summer, I conducted research on the racial biases in the treatment of pregnant women, and specifically the mediating roles of stereotypes and empathy within that relationship. Did you know that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes? Or that Black infant mortality rates are twice as high than that of white infant mortality rates? Black women are not the only ones being impacted here, but also their infants. Socioeconomic status, such as income, is not a protective factor, which is why other factors, such as racial biases among medical providers, have been examined in the literature. However, the literature on racial biases amongst medical providers rarely focus on maternal health care outcomes and rarely focuses on Black women as well. Black women have a unique social position in society that is distinct from Black men and white women. which leads into my first potential mechanism that I propose is correlated to this disparity, which is the stereotypes that are specific to Black women. The intersectional nature of Black women creates specific stereotypes and unique oppressions to arise that only apply to Black women. These stereotypes, such as Black women being promiscuous, have been shown in the literature to have an effect on the way that people perceive Black pregnant women. However, these stereotypes have not been linked to the maternal health care outcomes to Black women, which leads into the second proposed potential mechanism, empathy. Empathy has been examined across multiple studies showing that medical providers have more empathy for white patients compared to Black patients. Empathy has been examined in the pain treatment context, but not in the context of pregnancy treatment, and not specifically focusing on Black women either. This brings us to the present study, which will use an experimental design wherein participants will be exposed to white or Black target patients in order to examine whether the race of a pregnant woman will influence white Americans' perceptions of her symptom severity and medical treatment recommendations. We expect to find that if the target patient is white, then participants will perceive her in ways that are less consistent with the specific Black woman stereotypes. The less these specific Black women stereotypes are endorsed, the more empathy the participants will have for the target patient. The more empathy the participant has for the target patients leads to a greater perceived symptom severity. This study is important because these findings can allow for a greater understanding of maternal healthcare disparities involving Black women. And the future directions of this study can include using medical providers as participants to see if our findings here also apply to that population as well. I would like to say thank you to the McNair staff and faculty, and I would also like to extend my gratitude to my faculty mentor, Dr. Hoggard, and graduate student supervisor, Vanessa Hatton, for helping me along this journey. Once again, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Amalia Jimenez. I'm a McNair Scholar, and today I will be talking about restorative practices in schools. Restorative practices are community-based disciplinary measures that focus on the harm done in a conflict and how to move forward and repair this harm without excluding anyone from the community. The reason why restorative practices are being introduced and implemented is because current disciplinary measures, such as suspensions and expulsions, are disproportionately affecting Black students and contributing to trends such as the school-to-prison pipeline. However, there still needs to be more knowledge on how coordinators conceptualize the rolling out of restorative practices in schools. Therefore, I will be looking at the similarities and differences between two different restorative justice coordinators as they conceptualize a restorative justice model over time. As mentioned before, my participants are two restorative justice coordinators in urban high schools, mostly serving low-income students. They were interviewed over the phone annually over 3.5 years. The interviews were semi-structured, audio recorded, and then transcribed. The previously created 12 indicators for restorative practices will be used as the codebook to independently code interviews. I hypothesize that I will find convergence in all 12 of the indicators. However, I believe that there will be slight divergences when the restorative justice coordinators discuss indicators 1, administrative support, 2, school-wide buy-in, 7, student leadership and voice, and 11 and 12, repairing harm. Some key findings from the literature are that some schools will probably differ in opinions on buy-in and administrative support. As well, certain schools will have a narrow approach, focusing more on one factor of implementation over the others. I hypothesize that one restorative justice coordinator will focus more on repairing harm and the other more on student voice. These results could imply that in order to maximize the success of restorative practices, schools should consider not only the similarities, but also the uniqueness of each community. Therefore, it is crucial for future research to focus on each school as individual entities and analyze how a structured model can be modified and applied in different environments. To conclude, future research should focus on understanding what specific factors of restorative justice must be contextually attuned and what factors, if any, can be applied universally. I would like to take a moment to thank the Ronald E. McNair Postbaccalaureate Achievement Program staff and my faculty mentor, Dr. Gregory, for their constant support throughout the Summer Institute. I would also like to take a moment to thank you all for listening today.
Greetings, my name is Devin Williams. I am a rising senior and McNair Scholar at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. And for the McNair Summer Institute, I conducted an independent project under the guidance of Dr. Wright titled Politically Repressing the Proletariat, the Struggle Between the US Government and Black Nationalist Organizations. So throughout this presentation, we have to discuss a few things. The first being the aim of my research project and my research questions. We must identify the Black nationalist organizations in Detroit, which I studied. We must define political repression, and we must discuss the significance to this research project. So the primary research question to this research project is, how did political repression factor into neutralizing Black nationalist organizations in Detroit? We really want to figure out to what extent did political repression play in dissolving these organizations. And we do know that these organizations have been dissolved in Detroit. And we know that these organizations were big on advocating for the Black working class. So a follow-up question is also, how has the Black working class been impacted by the dissolvement of Black nationalist organizations? So we need to discuss Black nationalist organizations in Detroit. And the first is the Republic of New Africa, which was founded in Detroit in 1968. And they are making territorial claims to subjugate Southern states, demanding for the US government to cede the land in order to establish an independent Black republic. On the other hand, we are going to discuss the Black Panther Party, which advocates for self-sufficiency in their own neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, through the use of communal political engagement and armed resistance to police brutality. So now we must discuss political repression. And political repression can be defined as a state intervention to control political challengers that question society status quo. Sociologist Alan Wolf categorizes political repression into three categories. The first being covert repressive action, which is a way in which the government collects counterintelligence. Overt repressive action, which is the way in which the government exercises their force to neutralize these organizations violently. And legal repressive action, which is a way in which the government finds nuances in the law in order to indict political challengers and their organizations. So through our historical narrative research design, we come to the conclusion that political repression was the primary factor in dissolving the Republic of New Africa and Black Panther Party in Detroit. And as these organizations fell in Detroit, we noticed that the working class Black communities have become increasingly vulnerable. And the contemporary significance of this is that it led to government infiltration, further perpetuating racial disparities through initiatives like war on drugs and mass incarceration. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Errol Brown. I'm a rising senior, and I'm here to discuss the truth of learning. First things first, I was a research assistant under my faculty advisor, Dr. Janice Goldberg, with her research being a new innovation of technology called the InKids. My purpose statement was to investigate the importance of inquiry-based learning and highlighting the strengths and advantages over traditional learning styles. The potential work this has is to change the education field of how we are taught. Let me describe some terms for you. First things first, traditional learning styles. Traditional learning styles are normally when you learn through memorization and recitation techniques, thereby not developing critical thinking, quoted by Calef. Inquiry-based learning, on the other hand, is defined as formulating hypotheses and testing them by conducting experiments and or making observations, quoted by Pedesti. Let me explain to you guys what InKids is. InKids is a prime example of modern-day inquiry-based learning. It's a platform for students to learn how to conduct science experiments. First things first, students are aligned or first brought up with an investigative questions. An investigative question is basically a question that gets you to think. So a science question that basically gets you to think of what to do. First things first, they are broken up 3 steps. 1, asking questions or hypothesizing on how to figure out what's going on in this experiment. 2, carrying out investigations / collecting data, basically trying on actually doing the actual experiment, seeing what's going to happen. And 3, analyzing, interpreting the data, making sure, hey, why did this happen? Did this happen because of this? Trying to basically understand what's going on. The methodology I used for this were textual evidence research. I chose close readings of textual evidence research that relies on inquiry-based experiments to see what happens to typically middle school students when they are brought up with this new type of learning. I found this mostly, these sources mainly through Rutgers Library search engines. My results or investigative results were that there was an increase in participants' positive attitudes towards the science concept that resulted through the results, basically through their experiments. Inquiry-based learning, on the other hand, is shown to be more hopeful towards students than typical traditional learning styles when it comes to pursuing a STEM career and their grades. The findings for this research was that it can have a new insight on the education system as a whole, as well as introduce new types of learning to teachers and students with the adaptation to online educational tools. Basically, tools like InKids, NLP, and other NLP auto-scoring tools. Basically, NLP auto-scoring tools are tools that basically that answer or grade essay graded work. So basic experiments. These are my literature so you guys can see that I quoted everything and make sure everything's cited perfectly. And I just want to thank everyone for listening and giving me the chance to explain my research topic. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.
My name is Georgina Duker. I'm a rising senior at Rutgers University, and I'm working with Dr. Maurice Elias on my research called Approaches to Social Emotional Learning During the COVID-19 Pandemic. For this presentation, I will be talking about the background and definitions, research question methods, expected findings, implications, and finally, my acknowledgements. So COVID-19 has caused financial hardships for caregivers and students. They may have lost their family members, and on top of that, increased virtual learning and social distancing has also been associated with lack of sleep, low levels of energy, isolation, and feelings of anxiety. So at this time, school connectedness is at a low. For my project, I will be looking at how social emotional learning can help this. Social emotional learning, or SEL, is considered as the process of acquiring and applying the skills to create and maintain healthy, supportive relationships with oneself and others, making responsible decisions, being able to manage one's emotions, and also being able to problem solve effectively. Currently, some schools teach social emotional learning by integrating programs or interventions into their current curriculums. This can be done directly or indirectly, and this is what my research is looking at. An example of indirect SEL is a program called Student Taking Action Together, or STAT, where students learn about active communication, perspective taking, and disagreeing respectfully through already established activities in classes such as social studies. A direct social emotional learning program is one called Overcoming Obstacles, which is taught in about 15 minutes on its own, and it's aimed towards teaching healthy decisions in life, such as being able to reduce stress, eating healthy, being able to participate in teamwork, and it's not embedded in any class. So the overall research question is, will a direct or indirect social emotional learning intervention be most efficient for increasing SEL competency and school connectivity in New Brunswick High School after the COVID-19 pandemic? That's the research question. For an abbreviated version of my methods, students ages 14 to 18 of the New Brunswick High School will participate in this experimental research, where 2 classes for each grade level will participate in STAT, while 2 classes for each grade level will be participating in overcoming obstacles. And there will also be 2 classes per grade level for a control group that will not have an intervention, but will have their regular classes. There will also be a questionnaire that students will take before and after the interventions that will focus on school climate and school connectedness, as well as a scale for teachers to assess their social emotional learning skills before and after the intervention. So by participating in both of these interventions, the students can learn skills such as effective communication, healthy decision, and self-management. And this study will inform strategies used to teach social emotional learning in the future.
My name is Henry, and I'll be guiding you through cunning contaminants and microbes that modify them. First, what's a microbe? Well, it's an organism that is so small it can only be seen under a microscope. And in this study, we focus on anaerobic microbes, which only live in places where oxygen is absent, such as sediment. PPCPs stand for pharmaceuticals and personal care products. They're in the things you use in everyday life, such as shampoo, toothpaste, and medication like Benadryl. PPCPs are taken in by the body, but are not fully used and end up down the drain and eventually in our waters. This is why this issue is so significant, because we have begun to see the negative effects PPCPs have on wildlife, such as fish, which we eat. And so, through the analysis of DNA sequence data, the research question that was investigated was, can specific microbes responsible for the degradation of certain PPCPs be identified? Here we see 2 bars that showcase the bacterial diversity present in samples that were amended with PPCPs that are known as nonylphenol or octylphenol, both of which are found in detergents. And the 3rd bar is a control where no PPCPs were added to the sample. The bacteria here are represented by families, which is a taxonomic level that encompasses genus and species. Compared to the control, it was observed that bacterial families, such as Ruminococcaceae in the green, was found in less abundance in the nonylphenol and octylphenol samples. Bacterial families that were observed to have been in less abundance in the PPCP samples may indicate that these families may not be tolerant to nonylphenol or octylphenol. On the other hand, the family Synergistaceae in the orange experienced 3 times more abundance in the PPCP amended samples. Members in this bacterial family have been found to play roles in degrading other chemicals, and this suggests that degradation could also be its role in these PPCP samples. The key takeaway here is that the diversity of bacteria changes depending on what has been added, with microbes that potentially play a role in degradation becoming more abundant in PPCP samples. The next step that could be taken would be to develop a project in which to identify microbes that have the genes or DNA that allow them to degrade chemicals. This was also just a look at 2 of many PPCPs that are used in everyday life, and all must be analyzed in order to not only protect the environment, but one's health and the health of loved ones. Thank you.
everyone. I'm Jassie Morcos, a rising senior at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, studying political science and American studies and human resource management. Today, I'll be discussing my research on constitutional myths and miseducation under the advisement of Dr. Lisa L. Miller through the McNair program. My research question is how, when, and why did constitutional myths and miseducation begin appearing? To understand this question, we have to question what constitutional myths are. In this case, the focus is on states' rights, checks and balances, tyrannical majorities, and government overreach. While these are famously understood and known ideas and theories, they are actually misleading because they are not actual constitutional principles. This leads into the miseducation of civics because miseducation is, in my idea, understood to be a misleading or based on false information. So you're being taught something that isn't true, which has been taken on face value, hence the constitutional myths being perpetuated throughout governance and education. To find these ideas, we look at political party platforms through the American Presidency Project, distributed by the UC Santa Barbara School. And political party platforms highlight values, beliefs, principles, and goals of political parties. We looked at Democrats, Republicans, and third parties from the year 1860 all the way up until 2020, and highlighted every time these constitutional myths and terms were found or stated, or even just the ideas of them, which we found quite a few of. Then we moved on to civics textbooks, specifically We the People, Constitution Competition, and Advanced Placement U.S. History, the American Pageant, which were both located in New Jersey. These textbooks have also went through the exact same analysis of finding these terms of constitutional myths and these ideas, which were highly visible in the We the People competition textbook rather than the advanced placement textbook, but were still there nonetheless. The results, therefore, illustrate how constitutional myths are heavily embedded in American governance and education. Political parties perpetuate myth, but civics education teach the myth, which feeds into a cycle of constantly learning something and then having it being said to you again through politics. However, political narrative is driven by civics education, and that means the political system is currently flawed. Our civics education and political platforms and the political reality do not align. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan Freire, and today I'm going to be presenting on the economic development in Ecuador and the exporting of commodities. My research will be able to answer how is Ecuador economic development being affected by their exporting of commodities to the global market and developed countries. I am going to be using the contribution of the dependency theory by Raul Prebisch in the 1950s. Ecuador takes the position of the periphery and depends on the economic activity of developed countries known as the core. The periphery only expands when the core demands its primary products, also known as commodities, exposing its vulnerability to the global market. Therefore, the periphery is subordinate to the needs of the core. Economic activity is oriented to the needs of the world outside of Ecuador and not on local needs and development of the country. The main exporting and importing partners of Ecuador are the United States and China. The Observatory of Economic Complexity in 2018 reported that crude petroleum is 36% of exports and 90% goes to the United States. And the same crude petroleum that was exported to the United States returns as an import to Ecuador as refined petroleum. Also, about 45% of imports are made up of machines and refined mineral products that come from the United States and China, illustrating how about half of the imports are controlled by developed countries like the United States and China, and a great amount of exports are being sent to the United States. It is also important to mention that in 2018, according to the OEC, Ecuador had a trade deficit of negative $916 million, which means that the amount that they spent on importing was higher than the amount that they gained on exporting that year. This reduces their annual GDP and lowers their economic growth. Based on the data collected by the World Bank from 2018 to 2019, their GDP annual growth decreased, and since 2015, Ecuador has been in a period of stagnation, which is defined as little to no growth in a country's economy. Everything that is less than 3% on economic growth is considered as slow to little no growth in a country's economy. So what now? Ecuador should take into consideration the refining of their own petroleum and the production of machinery in order to boost their economy without the dependency of the court or reducing its own dependency. But this is not an easy solution, it's not an easy task for a developing country like Ecuador due to their less advanced technology, which creates the need to import machinery from the court. These are my references, and thank you so much to the program McNair for allowing me to do research this summer.
Hello, my name is Youssef. I'm a junior at Rutgers University, Brunswick. Over this past summer, I did research with Dr. Nan Yang at Mount Sinai and Icahn School of Medicine. My project is titled The Identification of Regulators in Neuronal Differentiation and Induction through CRISPR Gene Activator Screen. So one of the major promises in stem cells and regenerative medicine as a whole is that we'd be able to regenerate cells and tissue for people who have injury or disease that harm them in specific areas in the body. However, one of the issues that we've been facing is that we haven't been able to generate homogeneous cell lines with high specificity. So this means that we wouldn't be able to repair specific areas of the body and find and create these like very specific subtypes of cells that would be able to have some type of function within those areas. Now, this is a big problem as we like to treat these areas with high specificity. And if we were able to generate a high specific tissue, it would be able to prevent loss of function in the body and continue to work in a normal sense. So my project over the summer was starting to focus on this problem by trying to screen transcription factors for selective and efficient generation of inhibitory neurons. Basically, we were able to design a plasmid that contained guide RNAs for CRISPR to come and amplify via translation of these proteins so that we can use these proteins as building blocks for cells to basically differentiate into neurons and specific types of neurons, not just any kind. So what we did here is that we used these guide RNAs and designed this vector, and we did a Golden Gate, which assembled all components of the vector in one reaction. From there, we were able to basically clone the bacteria and select it and identify if it was if that bacteria actually got the plasmid that we got. And from there, we would take it, add it to HEK cells. From the HEK cells, we'd be able to identify which cells got the virus. As you can tell from the transfection of HEK 293 cells, we are able to see like a blue fluorescent that tells us, oh yeah, this cell has it, this cell doesn't. After about 3 to 4 days, all cells have it, which increase protein production of human embryonic kidney cells. And then we take these proteins to package them and add them to embryonic stem cells, which we then should see some types of differentiation by cell change in morphometry. And in the end, we were able to use CRISPR-Cas9 activator using a TRPA activator called VPR to generate inhibitory neurons using the transcription factors of ACL1 and DLX2 guide RNAs. So you could actually see how selective it is when we look at the neuronal markers found through immunofluorescence and the neuronal morphometry, where we see that that the dyes TJ1 and MAP2 are very specific to neurons in our ACL1 guide RNAs compared to the positive control and the non-targeting control. So this does verify that we do generate neurons with high specificity, and even more than that, we were able to we believe that we were able to generate inhibitory neurons as detected by patch clamp. So we saw that ACL1 and DLX2 guide RNAs are sufficient in inducing neurons after 5 days post-selection of virus, and then that combinations of both guide RNAs were able to increase expression of neuronal markers. So when we combine them, we should start forming inhibitory neurons. Now, not all the neurons are going to be homogeneous, so they're not all going to be of the same type. But we hope that from there we would be able to identify which neurons are of that subtype, and then select that for further analysis and further generating other subtypes of neurons, right? So from the inhibitory neurons, we would be able to further identify other types of inhibitory neurons and help use that for identifying like models and diseases that we could use in the lab. And hopefully one day we'd be able to go back and regenerate these cells in humans in hopes that we could treat humans for injury or disease. However, there are many steps that need to be taken, and we should observe how this plasmid and CRISPR activation would increase generation of neuronal induction. As you can tell, like this is a very preliminary study, and there's a lot of steps that need to be undertaken. And I'm very excited to see how this field goes and how we're going to continue this project in the future to work on advancing this technique. Thank you so much for coming and listening to my presentation. I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sundus Reshid, and I will be sharing my findings of how to effectively reduce implicit racism among future healthcare providers. Black people suffer from many health inequities, including heart disease, as far as being prescribed antibiotics, and the most recent health inequity they have been suffering from is COVID-19, where Black people are 3 times more likely to be infected with the virus than their white counterparts. Along with that, preliminary evidence suggests that doctors are less likely to refer symptomatic Black patients for COVID-19 testing. These inequities are affected by implicit bias, which is a subconscious prejudice toward a group of people based on their racial or ethnic identity. This bias results in racial healthcare inequities, which is how the quality of healthcare given is based on the race of a patient, which ultimately harms Black people the most, which is why I will be referring to it as implicit racism, despite it commonly being referred to as implicit bias. In order to reduce these health inequities among Black people, we must reduce the implicit racism among healthcare providers, which brings me to the plan that I created that would act to reduce implicit racism among healthcare providers. Research has shown that implicit bias is detected in early stages of a healthcare provider's career, which is why this plan starts with medical students in their first year of medical school and continues throughout their 4 years, which is one aspect that sets my intervention plan apart from others that have already been done. Along with that, this plan is under the mentorship of an anti-racism advisor and combined with their school curriculum. This program follows a 4-point theoretical framework that would help recognize and reduce the implicit racism among medical students in a medical setting. With that being said, Here, you see in the blue the implicit bias of participants in an intervention study that have already been done. And you see throughout the 3 different implicit association tests they were given, their bias decreases across the time of the study. Here in the red, you see my anticipated results based on the 4-point intervention plan in the first year of medical students alone. As you can see here, my program would significantly reduce implicit racism because of it being long-term, consistent, focused on racism, and being under the mentorship of an anti-racism advisor. In closing, implicit racism ultimately puts the lives of Black people at risk. And my research has shown to reduce this racism, which would ultimately keep Black lives safe. I would like to thank McNair and my faculty mentor, Dr. Devin English, for all the help and support with the research I have been able to share with you guys today. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Amina Meky. I'm a rising senior and a McNair Scholar at Rutgers University. This summer I've been working with Dr. Elio from the psychology department on the impact of COVID-19 on undergraduate Rutgers students. And what makes this topic very special is the fact that we can all connect to it since we've all lived through this pandemic and we want to know how it's affected us and how it will affect us. Today I'm going to talk about the research topic, why it's important, methodology, and then the preliminary results. So as for the research topic, what makes it important is because we're going to be able to comprehend the vulnerability of undergraduate Rutgers students' experience throughout the pandemic. And we're going to use those results to make a larger prediction on the general population of undergraduate students. This research is going to fill the gap in attention to college students' experience during this COVID-19 pandemic and focus on their suffering and their successes depending on the student. And our research question is going to be, what is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Rutgers undergraduate students' academic progress, social interactions, mental, physical, and emotional health? So this is going to be split into 3 separate categories. The first one being physical and mental health, the second one being academic progress, and the last one being social aspects / social interactions. As for our methodology portion, we're going to be using a quantitative approach through an online survey, which was given during the spring semester that just passed between February and April of 2021. 500 undergraduate Rutgers students received this survey and 250 were freshmen. The reason why there's so many freshmen is because the large enrollment in general psych, and part of the general psych requirement at Rutgers University is to get a certain number of RPUs, which is Rutgers participation units. And to get those, you have to participate in experiments and surveys, which is why we have more freshmen in this study. For the preliminary results from the first 249 students of the 500, we partially analyzed and we found out that depression and anxiety levels increased, the ability to focus and retain information decreased, learning quality decreased, meaning that students were not able to retain the information as fast and understand the course material. Lastly, GPAs increased, and we believe that it's because professors and administrators altered the course to fit an online environment. So Dr. Elio, myself, and his research team are still working on the rest of the analysis for the 500 undergraduate Rutgers students, but the rest is going to be focusing on the COVID-19 stressors, forms of distractions, and retention levels. Today we talked about the research topic, methodology, and the preliminary results. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this has helped you have a better impact and change in your own life, understand how this pandemic has affected you.
All right, everyone. You guys can feel free to spread out who are with us in person. To our virtual audience, thank you for being patient. Hope you guys enjoyed those pre-recorded videos. So we are now going to get started with our oral presentation portion. And so first up, we have our McNair Scholar, Mariam Walla.
Thank you, Dr. C, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Mariam Walla, McNair Scholar here at Rutgers, currently working under Dr. Elias, and my project title is Post-Emergency Remote Instruction, Relationships Between Adolescent Social Emotional Learning, Extracurricular Activities, and School Connectedness. So today I'll be going over some background and key concepts of my study, my research questions, proposed methodology, data analysis and anticipated findings, as well as my conclusion based on these findings. So first up, some background. As we all know by now, COVID-19 has resulted in a transition to emergency remote instruction. And what's key to remember is that in my study, I use the term emergency remote instruction over online learning because it emphasizes the fact that it was a very sudden solution to the pandemic, which is a crisis, and it wasn't a choice by the students. Online learning implies a choice. So during this time period, studies have shown that adolescents report social connection to be a major cause of concern, as they're reporting feeling very lonely and missing their friends. This is where social emotional learning, or SEL, can come into play, as it helps students and children among all ages be resilient during and after a crisis. Now, CASEL is a nonprofit organization that focuses on spreading evidence-based SEL throughout school systems, and they've developed the framework of 5 major competencies that SEL skills are based upon. This includes self-awareness, which is being aware of one's own emotions and the reasons behind them. Self-management, which is managing your behaviors based on these emotions. Social awareness, which is being aware and mindful of other people's emotions and perceptions. Relationship skills, which are your interpersonal skills and the way you create healthy relationships. And your responsible decision-making, which uses your ethics as a foundation to create goals that are not only going to help yourself, but also help other people, contributing back to society. Now, another key term is engagement and the difference between behavioral, emotional, and cognitive engagement. Behavioral is participatory, so this can be seen through attendance records. Emotional is your intrinsic motivation behind your behaviors. So this could be, for example, if a student joins a club, is it because they want to put it on their resume, or is it because they truly believe in the mission of the club? And cognitive is your willingness to complete this action. How willing are you to get out of bed and complete that action? And finally, the most important term is school connectedness. So this is how much students feel accepted, included, respected, and supported, not just by the teachers within the school environment, but also their peers. And the main difference between school connectedness and engagement is that engagement is very participation-based and very observable, while school connectedness is the perception of the student itself. Sometimes actions won't matter if the perception itself is negative. And this is why school climate is very important to study, especially trying to recognize how to turn it into a positive one. Right now, a meta-analysis has shown that 40 to 60% of students feel disconnected by the time they begin high school, also showing that middle school climate is very important to study right now, since it is that transitional period between elementary and high school. And if we can combat negative middle school climates and try to turn it more positive, we could lower the statistic through further research. So my current questions are, while attending a Northeastern public middle school, how are middle school students develop levels of SEL competencies related to their levels of engagement in extracurricular activities? As well as how does both SEL and engagement influence these students' school connectedness? The participants in my study will be 60 students from this Northeastern public middle school with 1 classroom per grade level, so 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And all these participants will be between the ages of 11 to 14 years old. There is no current demographic data of this current school year, but this is from the 2019 to 2020 school year, and the population sample is predominantly Black. My design is a sequential explanatory mixed methods design, meaning that there's 2 phases. The first phase is quantitative, which will use the DESA scale, which I'll explain in the next slide. And the second phase is qualitative through the use of focus groups among these students. So phase 1 is the Devereux Student Strengths Assessment, or the DESA. It's a 72-question tool that's used by teachers, and they answer it about 1 month into the school year after they've gotten some time to get to know each student, since these questions are based on the level of frequency that students have different behaviors. So how often do they ask for help? How often do they rely on other students? How often are they aware of their own emotions and the reasons behind them? And it aligns with the CASEL 5 framework that I showed earlier, but there are more specific categories, including optimistic thinking, goal-directed behavior, and personal responsibility. And based on the T-score results, students are going to be placed into either a high, average, or low comparison group. Phase 2 is going to be focus groups. There will be about 4 per grade level, so 12 in total, with about 5 students in each one. The questions are going to look into how they feel about in-person learning versus remote, how many clubs they're in, why they joined, and how supported they feel by their teachers. So a sample question is, if you were principal for the day, what changes would you make to your school? This implicitly measures school connectedness because based on the person's answers and as well as their body language, we can see if they already have a positive or negative perception of their school. And it also makes it more proactive, amplifying youth voice because now it gives a solution among them to show what kind of changes they want in that school. And all of these sessions are going to be recorded, transcribed, and coded. I plan to use 3 statistical models for these results. In the linear regression model, I expect to find a statistically significant positive relationship between SEL and engagement. So those with higher SEL are going to be more engaged in extracurricular activities. In the multiple regression model, I plan to find an increase in school connectedness based on the interaction between both SEL and engagement. And in the chi-square test, which is going to have the variables of school connectedness and engagement, each divided into high, average, and low comparison groups, I expect to find a positive relationship between engagement and school connectedness levels. So what does this all mean? Developmental psychology currently shows that middle school students, which in the US are usually between the ages of 11 to 14 years old, it's very normal for them during this time period to seek autonomy and individuality. However, it's currently presenting itself in a negative way based on the way we see that they feel disconnected from schools, and they also are participating less in extracurricular activities. Based on that earlier statistic I showed, which was the 40 to 60%, which is very alarming, we could try to combat this through further research by showing that if we improve school climate, we could possibly reduce this statistic and find other ways for these students and children to seek their individuality and autonomy. Because most studies, especially among SEL, typically focus on high school and elementary climate, this will also fill in the gap in literature on middle school climate, show the role that SEL plays on quality of school life, especially in relation to extracurricular activities and schools' motivations behind each activity. And it'll also push for SEL, engagement in extracurricular activities, and connectedness by administrators. My study's results, along with past literature, will contribute to the fact that students typically have a higher academic performance, lower dropout rates, and more well-rounded sense of personality and character when they're going through SEL-based interventions within school systems. And by focusing more on SEL, especially in middle schools, we can create people and characters that focus more on contributing back to society while helping themselves and other people simultaneously. Before I end off, I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Elias, Angela Wang, and the rest of the Social Emotional Character Development Lab, as well as the McNair staff and my cohort. There will be time for a Q&A, but if anyone has any other questions after this, you can contact me at mariam.walla@rutgers.edu. Thank you.
At this time, we'll take questions from the audience as well as from the virtual space. Feel free to walk up to the mic if you're in person. All right, so I'll break the ice. So what do you think are some long-term effects beyond high school that this kind of research will have?
So middle school is such a prime time for development that it can also influence the way you perceive your high school climate, which in turn also affects the way that you see like your career and just your social life in general. And by having SEL skills, you can apply that outside of like test taking in schools because now you take that to your career skills. And besides career, whatever life path someone chooses, it also increases your interpersonal skills so you can have more like positive relationships with everyone that you meet.
Okay, and we have a question from the chat.
Hello. Oh, hello. So we have in our virtual chat, how did you develop your research questions?
So it took a lot of trial and error because along with working with the lab, I had to be realistic about what resources I have, what student populations I can work with, and that kind of impacted what questions I have. Originally, I wanted to look into stigma, but especially with the pandemic's conditions, it just wasn't realistic. So I came across this question because I realized when studying the literature that middle schools weren't really looked into. And personally, I have a lot of little cousins who are in middle school, so it was just really interesting to also hear their experiences and how their schools just started off with SEL-based interventions and kind of comparing it to my own and my friends' impact from middle school and how I lacked SEL. So I just wanted to see the better relationship between middle school students' SEL levels and then things like extracurricular activities that are usually neglected in middle school but have a rise in high school because of resumes.
Thank you. And that actually came from someone who was very excited to have very similar research as you, by the way. So, and we have one more question. Do you think SEL can help students change their perception of their support systems in and outside of school to help improve resilience?
That's a great question, and I think it's kind of complex because it can kind of go hand in hand. Your support system can affect your perceptions of life in general, but on the other hand, your perceptions can affect the way that you view the people around you. So I think it is situational and it depends on the person, but if a person already has strong foundational SEL skills, that will probably already influence their perceptions to be more positive and kind of take life as it goes, including the people that they have around them, because relationships aren't perfect all the time.
Thank you. All right, and so That wraps up the Q&A for Miriam Walla. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for the informative questions in the chat in our virtual space. Next up, we have Ms. Jenica Scott.
Thank you, Dr. Chisholm. Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Jenica Scott. I am a senior from the School of Arts and Sciences, majoring in political science with a minor in international relations. And this past summer, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Jacqueline Duran on this research project entitled Teenage Problematic Sexual Behaviors, but I'll be focusing more specifically on an assessment of the social factors, which are the different things that affect a teenager or child's life, and how that can influence them to engage in problematic sexual behaviors. So for today's agenda, I will be giving a brief background and purpose, key concepts of my research problems and question, the proposed methodology, anticipated findings, implications, and then I'm going to wrap it up with the conclusions, acknowledgement, and of course, a works cited page. So what is teenage problematic sexual behaviors? It is any coercive, intrusive, or developmentally inappropriate acts that occurs in teenagers and children between the ages of 5 through 13. It's also the framework that I've utilized and defined as child or teenager that can cause emotional or physical harm. It is problematic because it can affect not only the students or the children who has perpetuated these acts, but also the acts that is perpetuated to another. So why is this important? Of course, outside of the fact that it causes emotional and physical harm, it occurs in 42 to 73% of children by the age of 13. And long-term effects, it can be conduct behaviors as well as attention deficit behaviors as well that will be able to impede on their social relationships for the most part. Generally, 50% of child or teenagers do engage in some form of sexual behavior by the time they're 13. This is the time when they're exploring themselves and learning more about themselves. So it is important to differentiate between normative as well as problematic sexual behaviors. Normative behaviors is innocent, child's play, innocent touching of private parts. It's not as frequent. It happens spontaneously, which is one of the factors that differentiates between problematic sexual behaviors, on the other hand, which is more coercive. It causes harm as well, and it happens frequently despite adult supervision or remedial efforts. So if this behavior continues for over a long span of time, that child may be incarcerated. However, it should be noted that children or teenagers who are diagnosed with PPSBs do not become future abusers. So why does this happen? Researchers have proposed multiple ways or factors that includes trauma, abuse, as well as psychological implications that would perpetuate the reason why teenagers or children engage in problematic sexual behaviors. However, according to the National Society of Sexual Behaviors Amongst Youths, they found that half to 1/3 of children and teenagers within their program do not have a history of trauma or psychological abuse or even psychological implications as well. They don't have that. That only means that there's only additional factors, and I would like to look at the social factors that can impact a child to engage in these behaviors. So social factors, according to the American Psychological Association, defines it as any attitudes, thoughts, or behaviors that impact a child's psyche. It affects their concept of selves, as well as how they perceive themselves and how others perceive them. So it has a psychosocial effect. In other words, a person's surrounding can have a lasting impact on how they behave, as well as lasting impressions on their psyche. So to answer this question throughout my research, I utilized the social ecological model, which is a 4-level tiered interplay between relationships, individuals, and community, and how that affects teenagers or influence them to engage in problematic sexual behaviors. So my research problem, for the most basic part, it's that problematic sexual behaviors occurs generally, it's on a rise, and that it can have social implications as well as psychological implications upon that child or teenager if not addressed soon. My research question deals with what impacts does social factors have on a child's development, as well what may influence them to engage in problematic sexual behaviors, as well as how can it possibly play a role in curbing recidivism rates. That is, to prevent a child from engaging in these behaviors in the future, even after being diagnosed or treated. So the methodology or my research design that I've utilized is a qualitative Delphi study that is currently being conducted by Dr. Jacqueline Duran. That is basically a 3-stage process where we are asked 3 15-question questionnaire, that is a tongue twister, 3 questionnaires over a span of 2 to 3 months. And it involves psychologists, clinicians, and different people within the field of teenage problematic behaviors or teenage behaviors or problematic behaviors as well. And they're basically coming together to form a conclusion, an opinion about the issue at hand, which is teenage problematic sexual behaviors. Of course, we're using a questionnaire, and we've utilized the platform Qualtrics, as you can see an example right there, on distributing that questionnaire. We're asking questions as what challenges did you find amongst your clients that is new or based on individual or social impacts that has been occurring before or prior to COVID. After we get our results, we're going to be utilizing a platform called NVivo, where we upload it and then be able to decode the results. So, of course, my anticipated findings, it will be that social factors do have an implication on a child's psychosocial development of a child. So it can be either negative or positive, either before or after before or after the child before a child becomes indoctrinated into problematic behaviors. The implication is that further research needs to be done on social factors and the influence it can have on that child's development, because there's not a lot of research out there on it. Another finding is that positive social indicators, which is like positive socialization, can curb the impacts of PPSBs as well as curb recidivism rates. The role of positive engagement or socialization can help that child or teenager through community-based membership as well. To conclusion, there's a prevalence of PPSBs among children. There are multiple factors that influences them to engage in these behaviors. These factors can, but I decided to talk about the social factors that can have an impact on their lives. And of course, we utilize the Delphi study to be able to garner those results. I would like to thank, of course, Dr. Jacqueline Duran for allowing me to be able to take a piece of her research and go out with it. Of course, my professors, Professor Cunningham, Dr. Garcia, Dr. Jaffe, and of course, Dr. Chisholm for guiding me through this process. Of course, the McNair program for giving us this platform to advance our scholarship, as well as my cohort. These are my works cited, and thank you. Any questions? Thank you.
All right, and now we'll take questions from the audience as well as the virtual online chat. Audience.
I have a question. First of all, great job, as expected. So you mentioned positive socialization and like community-based engagement. So do you have any examples for us of what that positive socialization would look like for these kids?
Yes, most definitely. Thank you for your question. So positive socialization, it deals with the different community engagement programs that a child can engage in before, like after school programs, positive sex talks, especially during this age that, you know, hormones are raging. So during that time, that is like the positive social impacts, as well as, of course, community members being like, you know, your neighborhood watch, it takes a village to raise a child, to make sure that they're not engaging in behaviors, to make sure that, okay, if you're watching something that is rated R, to make sure that you're aware of the room and make sure that no one is like, like no little children is there, so that you do not expose them to certain problematic behaviors. And of course, different ways to deal with their anger or different energy outlets. So in that regards, yes. No problem, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the chat? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janica.
No problem, thanks.
All right, can we get another round of applause for Jenica and for Miriam? I just wanted to make a note, and as we get ready for our next presenter to come up on stage, that a lot of our scholars had to do a lot of this work virtually. So because of the ongoing pandemic, they were restricted in many ways, but have been super resourceful and supported by amazing McNair faculty to conduct this research. And so I just wanted to get another round of applause. Of course, you two back there in the virtual space in our chat, you could drop some reactions, some emojis, please. I can see it, so that we know that you see our students and that they have the support of you all. So again, one more round of applause for all the amazing work. And then I will let Mr. Wiswall come to the stage and take it from there.
All right, here we go. All right, hi everybody. My name is Mohammed Wiswall, and today I'm going to be presenting on my research I did in correlation with Dr. Mary Rigdon, decision-making under risk and how rural Bangladesh can inform behavioral economics about risk. So what is behavioral economics? Broadly, it's a field that analyzes how people reason about factors in economic decision-making. It implements behavioral game theory to further understand the decision-making process. And after data collection, the goal of behavioral economics is to prescribe theories about how people can optimize or make better their decision-making process. Our research also goes into the intersection of development economics, which analyzes the relationship between factors such as health, literacy, land ownership, and context in general, and economies in the developing world. And the goal of development economics is to inform policy formation in the developing nations with the goal of improving economic and life conditions overall. So just to briefly go over some definitions, risk is when decision makers are aware of all the probabilities leading to an unknown outcome, and they're also aware of the possibility of loss. And utility broadly is just something of value. So today we're going to be talking about money, but this could be a service, this could be gas, anything that an individual or community finds valuable. And since we're going to be researching risk attitudes, they fall into three main categories. Somebody who's risk averse, so they avoid risky decisions and they prefer certain outcomes in utility. Somebody who's risk seeking, so they choose riskier decisions in order to gain a higher utility. And somebody who's risk neutral and they're indifferent and they don't care about either outcome. So just to get the point across, let's take an example of a coin toss. Let's say me and you guys, or we can all pretend I'm talking to each of you individually. Basically, let's say that we play a game of heads and tails, both of us put in $5, and whoever wins leaves with $10. And some of you may be willing to take the bet in order to make the $10 and risk the 5, and some of you will be like, no, I want my $5. But let's say we increase the risk by putting in $10 or $20 each, and as the risk increases, you'll see that your risk attitude will change. So expected utility theory is a normative theory about how rational agents and decision makers should be making decisions under uncertainty. So in this theory, they argue that decision makers should always choose whatever increases their utility. However, prospect theory is a descriptive theory about how people actually behave towards risk. And what they found was that decision makers view and value gains and losses differently. And it's actually a rebuttal of expected utility theory, which dominated the field for a while. And once this theory came out, it actually won Daniel Kahneman a Nobel Prize in economics. The purpose of the current study is to measure risk attitudes in rural Bangladesh, collect data on contexts such as poverty, savings, illiteracy, and land ownership, and look for possible relationships between these contexts and risk attitudes. Now, research questions are: what kind of relationships does poverty, illiteracy, and land ownership have with risk attitudes? How our results differ from previous studies done in the developed and developing nations? And our hypotheses are the following. One, we're going to expect that high poverty rates in Bangladesh will cause subjects to be more risk averse than risk loving. Two, that contexts such as poverty and illiteracy will correlate with these risk attitudes. And three, that we expect that these results to differ from which the majority of research is done in the Western world and in developed nations. We expect it to differ from that due to cultural, educational, and economic differences. So why did we choose Bangladesh? People in Bangladesh face a moderate to high level of risk on a day-to-day basis, such as arsenic-contaminated drinking water, drought in farming, and climate change. And for those of you who don't know, Bangladesh is actually expected to lose about 17% of its shores due to rising sea levels. And quite little research in behavioral economics has been implemented in the area. However, neighboring regions such as India, Nepal, and Burma are all areas that have had previous work done. In these photos, they describe an accurate farm-to-market lifestyle that's mostly held in rural Bangladesh. And in this last photo shows a current and recent crisis on the region, which is the Rohingya genocide, where the Rohingya ethnic group has been fleeing into Bangladesh, has been causing the economy to be more unstable. I think it's costing, about a couple $2 billion a year to support this community. So the type of research we're going to be doing is experimental lab and field research. So what's different in this is that we're not going to be asking participants to come to us, but rather we're going to be going to them. So we would set up in community centers such as mosques or just places of gathering to recruit people. And we're going to be using a household survey to collect the data on occupation, income, land ownership, and other contextual information. And the method that we're going to be using, the experimental methodology, is a simple lottery game. And the purpose of it is to record and elicit participants' responses to risky monetary decisions. And it helps us easily categorize and measure risk attitudes amongst our participants. And basically how the lottery game works is that participants are placed in front of 2 decks of cards, which you'll see here. And deck 1 is a low risk deck. So this deck is either going to lead to a profit of $5 or $7, regardless of what card is drawn. And deck 2, which is a high risk deck, it's either going to lead to a profit of nothing or 0, and one that can lead to 11. So you can see the discrepancy here is that deck 2, you can either win nothing or you can win a lot, or deck 1, you can win something, even though it may be lower than deck 2. And they're going to be asked which deck they want to draw a card from, and these are the choices, and depending on which deck they choose, will categorize their risk attitude. So we expect a strong negative correlation between risk aversion and poverty. We're also expecting a positive correlation between land ownership and risk attitudes. And we're definitely expecting our results to differ from previous studies done in the developed world. But let's say our hypothesis is disconfirmed and our results don't support it. This would indicate that there's actually been a shift in risk preferences in the developing world, which would differ from previous research. And in this graph, you can see that this is just an example of what one of our results would be, where as we expect wealth to go up, as wealth to go down, risk aversion to go up. But in conclusion, the study is going to implement a simple lottery game to further understand risk attitudes in developing nations such as Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is chosen for its high variables of risk, such as climate change and the other variables we discussed. And this research is going to inform policy solutions that can hopefully alleviate feelings of risk for rural Bangladeshis and farmers there. Our main takeaway is that, and it's important to emphasize this, our study argues that contexts such as poverty have a relationship with risk aversion. What our study is not arguing is that risk aversion is an explanation of poverty. But we want to get this point across because a lot of previous research has argued that poverty can sometimes be a byproduct of not taking an investment, which, as all of us know, is a risky monetary decision. But what we're trying to get at is that we need to understand historical context, as it's crucial. And Bangladesh, for example, has a sad history of British imperialism, religious and ethnic conflict, and also genocide and war. But these results are translatable to the developed world and even to farmers here in America. And hopefully this is going to inform policy solutions here as well. Oh, there we go. And lastly, I just want to thank the following people: Dr. Mary Rigdon at the Center for Philosophy of Freedom, Chase Agelli at Cornell for the feedback, and my fellow McNair Scholars for discussion, and the faculty of the Ronald E. McNair program.
Thank you. And now we'll take questions from the chat virtually as well as in person. All right, I'll ask. So, what do you think that are some long-term benefits to the United States taking an interest in what's going on with Bangladesh?
Yeah, I think broadly, one kind of broad thing that kind of encapsulates everybody's mind is that if Bangladesh stabilizes as a region and becomes a player in the global market, that's just going to be good for everybody, as that we already take advantage of a lot of labor there. And I think the other thing that comes directly from this research is that a farm is a farm and a rural area is a rural area. And a lot of the research here is translatable, as that we're trying to convince farmers in America to switch over to greener farming techniques. But we need to alleviate those feelings of risk when they're taking on something new versus something they've been doing for years. And some ways that we can do that, and we discussed in the research, was having community funds, having insurance policies, so that those feelings of risk are alleviated, and we can nudge farmers wherever they are, whether they're in Bangladesh or in rural America, to take on greener technologies.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. All right. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you again, Mohammed. All right, so rounding out our oral presentation talks, we have Ms. Sadie, last but not least. Come on up.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sadie Sedano. I am a senior at Rutgers University, the Blaustein School, majoring in public policy. And today I will be presenting my research, I Don't Want to Live in a City, Representing the City and the Right to Placemaking in De-Democratized New Brunswick, New Jersey. And I was afforded the opportunity to conduct this research at Brown University last summer. And I'm very grateful for being here with you all. And so to begin, my research takes place in New Brunswick, New Jersey, specifically with the story of the Lincoln Annex School and the way that the New Brunswick community was able to interact with political systems and power. And I encourage you all to listen, because these folks are our neighbors, whether we identify them as such or not. And so the Lincoln Annex School story, just briefly speaking, was a story of the demolition of a local elementary school where 750 economically disadvantaged and mostly Latino students accessed their elementary school education. Over the spring of 2021, perhaps some students may have seen that the elementary school was demolished in order to replace it with a cancer research institute by Robert Wood Johnson and Rutgers University. And while for many folks, and perhaps for many stories conducted through the media or through our university, the story was about the demolition of a building. However, throughout my research, as I interviewed community members and community organizers, this story was much more than simply a building. They were able to interact with their political systems, and there was several unveilings of what power and social justice actually look like, and I encourage us all to pay close attention. And so specifically today, what I will be addressing is not necessarily the Lincoln Annex School demolition, but more so the Lincoln Annex struggle and what the residents were able to uncover about what democracy and local democracy looks like, specifically within communities that are engaging in gentrification, and how business power and political power are very much intertwined with community power. And so very briefly, to begin, my methodology consists of community interviews, public record investigations, so that looks like looking at Board of Education minutes and agendas and those sorts of things, and literature reviews of scholars from urban sociology to political sociology to all those in between. And essentially, all of these resources and data were used to create a sense or illustration of the condition of the public in public policy. And as a public policy student, this was quite important for me. And also the future of urban social change and social change in general, which many of us here, especially those interested in Access Week, are very much engaged in. And so today I will go through, first and foremost, a brief theoretical explanation of how I got to the conclusion that processes of gentrification create almost inevitable processes of de-democratization. That is, where communities are unable to engage in the creation of their own societies, either it be with education, housing. They're not able to necessarily see their community as an ecosystem that they create and that they determine the development and the nourishment that occurs in that ecosystem. And I will also explain how de-democratization occurred in the story of the Lincoln Annex struggle, And I will conclude with a concept of power literacy and how community members, but also all of us here in academia, are very much inclined to creating power literacy to accomplish the goals of social change we're interested in. And so to begin, like I mentioned, briefly explaining how gentrification produces processes of de-democratization, the first step in that process would be to essentially redefine what the city is in and of itself. And so the city no longer becomes a vital community, an ecosystem, a nourishing environment, you name it, as we may understand our communities, our hometowns, for example, to be. Instead, a city becomes a site of market expansion. And so you're maybe not used to a market being a tangible thing. I know Jonathan in the audience in business school may understand, but essentially a city becomes a more tangible thing, right? You can drive through it, you can see it, you can touch it with your hands, when the city is essentially created for the purposes of market expansion and profit generation. And one of the folks who I interviewed illustrated this perfectly when she said she didn't want to live in a city, she wanted to live in a community instead. And so what happens when the geographical location of a city becomes a tangible market in a sense? Which brings me to the second point. What does it mean to be a constituent, a citizen, a resident in a geographical manifestation of a market? And so essentially, many scholars, including Wendy Brown, who I counseled a lot for my research, argues that this sort of governance shifts government attention away from constituents towards the idea of business partners. And they facilitate business, and their departments and frameworks are intended to facilitate that business. Which brings me to my last point and the ultimate point of de-democratization, which is that democratic principles and the rule of law are neither guides nor serious constraints for urban governments and local governments engaging in gentrification projects. And so again, as I mentioned, for the Lincoln Annex School, what did de-democratization look like, and what are some examples of it happening? And so to your left, you'll see the Rutgers and Robert Wood Johnson Cancer Research Institute, which will be located adjacent to the Robert Wood Johnson Hospital right now. And it is the reason as to why the Lincoln Annex School was demolished in order to provide cancer research opportunities for the state. And so beginning in 2019, rumors spread that this Cancer Research Institute was going to be located at the site of the Lincoln Annex School. The community tried on several occasions to understand what was happening, get a behind-the-scenes idea, and begin to organize politically and just more generally amongst each other to understand what their course of action would be. However, there was a lot of gatekeeping of information, for example, and ultimately the students were relocated to a temporary school towards the post-industrial zone of New Brunswick, and essentially a neighborhood that is already, as we see on the map on the right, being slimmed down by these sorts of development projects that we find on George Street, Easton Ave, you name it, lost just one more aspect of their community environment. And on many occasions, residents attended city council meetings, they conducted research, community research, polls, took photography, you name it. They tried every way to be able to engage their politicians, city council meetings, and other representative bodies with their opinion. However, they found that whenever they expressed these opinions or shared this information, decisions seemed to already be solidified, or essentially their efforts were reactive rather than proactive or creating the community they engage with. And one of the residents who I interviewed summarized it as, democracy is being done all backwards in New Brunswick. And I'd argue if democracy is done in a backwards direction, is it democracy at all? And so moving forward, I have 3 questions that may be popping up to the audience, which the first is it a bit utopic of us to expect democracy to happen all the time? And the answer is, you may be right. So the scholars that I counseled with understand that real democracy, which is where the people manage for themselves the conditions of their own existence, is quite unrealistic, right? We can't always be attending to every aspect of our lives. However, they also reject the idea that people can't control more, or that people can't create more by themselves with their experiential knowledge. And this sort of idea comes from the fact that we are never essentially in a stagnant state of democracy, right? Democracy is not something that's created once and then continues to exist. Rather, societies are constantly in processes of becoming a democracy, and we can think of democracy as a spectrum or a scale, and in what direction are you moving in? Which brings me to the final point of we are always undergoing processes of either democratization, where people can engage in their communities and create their societies more, or de-democratization, where these sorts of political powers are being used for other purposes. And so my second question, or the second question that you may all be asking that my findings provide, is what becomes of the tenets of democracy and processes of urban de-democratization? So these tenets are like voting and representative bodies, and Sadie, what becomes of a city council meeting or civil liberties? And essentially, we see that they become illusions of democracy. And so what do I mean by illusions? And so illusions, we know that they give a semblance, right? But they can also be deceptive and produce myths. And so essentially, these sorts of local frameworks are providing myths that power lies with the people. And in that process, people begin to engage in organizing or engage in power generation that may not actually provide them the results, but may instead be absorbing their time or energy. And so the third question that may pop up in your mind is, well, then are they just simply deceptive? Are they theatrical? Are they presenting a reality that doesn't exist and simply constructing a myth? Or do they serve another purpose or function? And essentially, this was pretty much the crux or the core of my research findings, which was that the democratic frameworks essentially become mechanisms for market-driven policy making, and I'll just look over my notes briefly for this. So my research ultimately found that the processes and measures of control within these tenets, so for example, a representative body like the New Brunswick Board of Education, become vessels, provide practices and procedures for modifications to occur in the community for the interest of businesses. And so while we see that these sorts of bodies and procedures would allow the community to modify the community to their liking, they're actually available to business interests and other parties to modify the community to whatever they need for profit generation or other purposes. And so just to pretty much summarize my research, so we began with gentrification producing processes of de-democratization, specifically in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And we leveled off to what then becomes of tenets of democracy as they still exist. We still see voting and council meetings and representative bodies existing. And I explained that they essentially begin to produce myths that absorb organizers' time and energy. And I finished off with that these illusions of democracy, they still provide opportunities for change and creation, however, a kind that leaves community members as mere spectators to their own urban existence because that change and creation is afforded to other interests. And so just for me to conclude, very briefly, I look to my, a very motivational scholar for me, Audre Lorde, who implored all of us to understand that for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. This fact is only threatening to those who still define the master's house as their only source of support. And I also look to Mark Purcell, a scholar who I counseled a lot for my research, which urges all of us to cease being the political spectator and continually become the political actor. And in regards to Rutgers and Access Week, I encourage all of us to begin to reflect on how we may understand the government and these sorts of entities and institutions as facilitators to our research, either it be through funding, through partnerships, or the like, and really imploring all of us to understand that these entities and these bodies are not facilitators to everyone. And once we consider that, how may we engage in power literacy, which is essentially the creative thinking of how to develop power more creatively and in more community-based manners. And so I just repeat one thing that Audre Lorde said, which is that these tools may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game or produce impacts with our research and our work, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sadie. And now we'll take questions from the audience and the online chat.
Just want to say brilliant work. As someone who's done research on constitutional myths and miseducation, I see a lot of similarities between our work. But what would you say a solution might be? Because constantly all over the country, universities do take over where they are, and it continues to happen, not only New Brunswick. So what do you think a viable solution would be if, we have very limited power at our hands as the people?
So I think that one of the most important aspects is to understand how universities simultaneously function as businesses. and really being able to encourage our universities to think of business ethics and how to engage in those sorts of activities in a more considerable and perhaps moral manner. And I know that some people may argue that businesses are not held to the same moral account as certain folks, but I think that a university in and of itself, right, which is a beacon of education for the purposes of displaying new ideas of ethics and creation and those sorts of things, I think it's important to really implore them to think of their own creation and ethics in a particular way. And so something that really stood out was the fact that Rutgers, while being an educational institution, is also very much interested in crafting New Brunswick to be an additional aspect of the educational experience. And perhaps one place to start is to understand how entitled are we to New Brunswick? Is there any other way that we can expand the educational experience for students and faculty while also respecting the fact that there are other folks who have the right to be able to live and nurture themselves in their own ways? I hope that answered your question.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much.
All right, and I think we have a question from the chat.
Okay, sorry, I forgot about that.
Yep, we have a question back here.
Okay.
If you were brought onto a team to help improve some of the issue you illustrated today, what would be the first move you would make?
Okay, I'm sorry, what was the end of the question?
What would be the first move you would make?
The first move I would make? That's a great question. I go to actually a graduate student currently at Rutgers who really, I was able to collaborate with them intellectually. And we spoke about this idea of democratizing more features of the community. And I referred to this through one of the scholars as well that I counseled for my work, of understanding how more venues in the community can be democratized. And so thinking of voting systems within the Board of Education, for example, rather than there being an elected body that is elected by the community, being able to give one person one vote or one parent one vote system, and really respecting that sort of process can allow people's opinions and organizing to actually have an impact rather than simply convincing another body or being reactive to a decision. They would actually be gathering a consensus and then taking that onto action. So I think democratizing as many aspects of the community as possible and really engaging with community organizers and community members, not just as an afterthought or as collaborators, but active creators in the interactions. So perhaps some sort of council here at Rutgers or in collaboration, deep collaboration with Rutgers.
All right, thank you so much, Sadie. Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you, Jenica, and thank you, Miriam. With that, we are wrapping up. So I want to give a shout out to our virtual space attendees who have joined us, also those in person with us. But I also want to give key acknowledgement and recognition to our scholars. So for the past 2 years, it's been very trying for them to have an in-person experiential learning experience through McNair because we were limited with physical in-person abilities because of the pandemic. But I think in this space, you guys have been able to join in for the first time in person. All of you are here, so this is an accomplishment. So can we get a round of applause for that? And then also having the chance to actually stand next to your research, explain it to those who are interested in knowing a lot more about your research interests, but who you are and what you want to do beyond Rutgers. And so I feel so much joy in my heart knowing that we have a bright future because the world is in your hands and you guys are going to be our leaders who are running it. So I'm ready to see all the change and the great things that are to come from you all. I also would be remiss if I did not shout out our support staff. So McNair is a small but mighty team. And so I need to acknowledge all of the people that help. So Professor Cunningham, Sherry is a doctoral student, but she helps to run so many things with McNair. Yes, let's clap it up. So many things with McNair. And she helps our scholars, helps to mold them to think about different things. We push our scholars a lot, so they're amazing. They're great in their own rights, but we always constantly push them to be greater. I know we do get on your nerves because we're like your aunties you never asked for, but you're stuck with us now, so just embrace it and love it. Also, our other graduate student mentor, Mary Lou Rodriguez. So Professor Rodriguez also wears many hats, but also helps to mold the minds of our scholars. We have our lovely Miss Meave Woods, who always assists and has been helping us over the past year and change or whatever we need. my in-support staff through Educational Equity Group, so Upward Bound Math and Science. I see you, I thank you. Thrive SSS, you guys always show up and show out for us. Know that you're appreciated. And then again, to you guys, the McNair Scholars, I want you all to take this moment in to acknowledge your accomplishment. Stand in this moment, be appreciative of the opportunity that you have to make change and impact change on not just Rutgers and our Rutgers community, but the community throughout. So can you please give yourselves a round of applause one more time? You know, I never get tired of showering y'all with praise. And then lastly, I would like to thank our community partners. So we do a lot of partnership, and we share our scholars with many different programs across the campus. And so I would, want to acknowledge Arresti Research Center, also LSAMP, the Learning Center. So if I missed you, please charge it to my head, not my heart, and know that we recognize you and we see you. And our faculty mentors who work with our McNair Scholars, we do appreciate you. And with that, thank you for attending. Thank you for joining us. And please be on the lookout for more McNair events. And we will be dropping in the chat some other resources and information for you guys to stay connected to future events that we hold. So thank you again for joining us. Those who are in person, we will direct you to get some lunch to go. Thank you again, everyone.